Did you hear about the Federal Reserve?
No, what about the Federal Reserve?
They are not federal and have no reserves.
Really?
Yes, and they are still engaged in a process called the quantitative easing, almost 13 years after the 2008 financial crisis.
What is the quantitative easing?
It is a process by which they make large asset purchases such as treasuries using currency they created out of thin air.
What does that mean?
It means since 2008, they have been increasing the money supply in order to keep the economy afloat. That is in addition to years of 0% interest rates.
What does that mean?
It means that since the last financial crisis, the Fed has been blowing a bubble in just about every financial asset, including bonds, stocks, real estate, corporate debt, you name it.
Why?
Because people such as the Ben Bernanke, the Janet Jello, and the Jerome Powell think they understand economics. They are Keynesian economists who believe that central bank intervention into markets and massive inflation of the money supply are the answer to propping up the US economy.
But you don't think that will work?
It cannot work. It is the economics of a banana republic.
Who is the Ben Bernanke?
The Ben Bernanke was a well-meaning chairman of the Fed, who was well known for having a nice beard.
Who is the Janet Jello?
The Janet Jello is the current United States Secretary of the Treasury, but she also used to be the chair of the Fed.
Doesn't her new job conflict with her old job at the Fed?
Apparently not. She says there is no conflict, but nobody believes her. She was an avid money printer at the Fed, and now she is working in an administration, which is hell-bent on borrowing money from the Jerome Powell at the Fed, so the government can spend it into the economy to recover from the pandemic.
Why did they think the Janet Jello would be qualified to be the Treasury Secretary?
I don't know. She looks like somebody's grandmother who got lost in the Bronx and wound up running the world's largest economy. She was appointed by the President Biden.
Who is the Jerome Powell?
He is the current chairman of the Fed. He has overseen a 40% increase in the US money supply in just the last year. That represents a massive dilution of the purchasing power of the US dollar.
Is that why everything is getting more expensive?
Yes. When you increase the money supply, you have a greater number of dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services, so the prices of everything tend to rise. This is the inflation. But it is worse than that.
Why is it worse than that?
Recently, the President Biden administration sent stimulus checks to all US citizens to help kickstart the economy after the COVID pandemic.
Yes, I received one of those.
Yes, I did too. This is the so-called helicopter money that nobody believed would ever become a thing. But now it is a thing.
What is helicopter money?
Helicopter money is where the Jerome Powell prints the currency with the stroke of a key on a keyboard, and uses it to buy the treasury bonds, issued by the Janet Jello. The Janet Jello then sends the currency to citizens, as if they were flying overhead in a helicopter and throwing it out of the window onto the population below.
You've got to be shitting me?
No, I am not. I wish I were.
But there is no such thing as free money.
That is correct. There are always consequences of these types of programs, including the increase in the national debt and the danger of rising inflation, as recipients spend their handouts into the economy. This is what the Ben Bernanke, the Janet Jello and the Jerome Powell do not understand. Wealth in the economy can only be created through the labor of the people, it cannot simply be printed into existence.
So if they are printing all this currency, the Fed must believe we need more of the inflation.
Yes.
Why do they think that?
Because of the CPI.
What is the CPI?
The CPI is used to measure the rate of inflation in the economy. It is currently running at roughly 2.5%, so the Fed believes there is no inflation, or that if there is, it is transitory.
What does transitory mean?
Nobody knows. It is a word the Ben Bernanke made up after 2008.
But aren't the food prices higher than a year ago?
Yes.
Aren't the gas prices higher than a year ago?
Yes.
Aren't the healthcare costs higher than a year ago?
Yes.
Aren't the transport costs higher than a year ago?
Yes.
Aren't the stock prices higher than a year ago?
Yes.
So why is the CPI so low?
Because the CPI is particularly bad at tracking the actual things that people buy. The CPI fails to capture rises in energy and food costs, and the fact that consumers buy lower cost options when prices rise. It also does not include real estate or stock prices, which have been rocketing higher to record levels.
But doesn't that make the CPI a poor measure of the inflation?
Yes. It effectively means the Fed and the government are blind to the rising costs of living in our economy. But that is not a surprise, because they have failed to predict every major financial crash in the last 30 years.
They were not able to predict the crash of the dot-com bubble in 2000? And the crash of the subprime housing bubble of 2008?
No. Actually, they were the cause of those bubbles inflating in the first place.
Has anything the Fed has done had a positive effect on the economy?
No. It has served only to increase the price of financial assets that the banks and wealthiest people own. It has had little to no effect on the prosperity and wealth of the average person. In fact, the quantitative easing is basically a stealth tax on every citizen, because it dilutes the purchasing power of the currency in your pocket in a very quiet and insidious way.
This is ridiculous. So what you are telling me is that the Fed thinks prices are lower than they actually are. Financial assets have been inflating since 2008, enriching the banks and the wealthiest in society, and that the primary measure they use to measure all this is completely inaccurate.
Yes. But it is worse than that.
How is it worse than that?
The Fed has been keeping interest rates at artificially low levels, to prevent defaults in debt-based instruments across the financial spectrum. Companies have been borrowing money to buy back their own stock and issuing bonds to finance their own survival. They could do this because the interest rates have been so low for so long. All of this relies on keeping the interest rates low. If the interest rates rise, many of these zombie companies will not survive.
What will cause the interest rates to rise?
The inflation. When the inflation rises, the interest rates should rise to prevent the economy from overheating. But if the interest rates rise, these zombie companies will not be able to afford the interest payments on their debt. But it is worse than that.
How is it worse than that?
The COVID pandemic has reduced the capacity for the economy to produce the goods and services people want. It has also meant that during the lockdowns, people have saved a lot of currency that they are now ready to spend. In addition to the stimulus checks people received, and the increase in the currency supply from the Fed, the velocity of the currency being spent into our economy will increase, causing even greater inflation of prices.
What about the US government?
If the interest rates rise, the US government will also find it much more difficult to pay the interest on their debt. In fact, every 50 basis point rise in the US 10-year bond would add the equivalent cost of the annual spend of the entire US Navy to the cost of servicing the debt each year.
Wow, that is a lot. How much does the US government owe?
The US national debt is over $28 trillion. It is equivalent to over $85,000 for every man, woman and child in the United States.
So can I assume that the Fed does not want the interest rates to rise?
Correct. The Fed actively purchases the rolling debt of the government in the bond market to keep the rates low. This is another aspect of the quantitative easing, because they print more currency out of thin air to do this.
Does that further increase the debt?
Yes. The money system only works because each year, debt is created in excess of the debt plus the interest of the debt that was accrued the previous year. there is no plan to ever pay off the debt, because the amount is simply too large to ever pay back.
So what does this mean?
It means that, the debt must be inflated away. The rampant quantitative easing they have been doing since 2008, has blown up an everything bubble, and that bubble is about to pop. The inflation is the pin that will pop the everything bubble.
Why?
Because when the inflation increases, as it is already starting to do, bond buyers stop buying bonds, because they worry about the ability of the government to pay the interest. This causes rates to rise. When the rates rise, stocks will sell off, because the cost burden on companies having to service their debt makes them less valuable and the cheap money dries up. This sell-off is likely to cause a panic. In response, the Jerome Powell will do the only thing he can do, and print more currency.
What will the Jerome Powell do with the new currency?
The Jerome Powell will use the printed currency to buy more bonds across the financial spectrum, to try to keep the interest rates low. However, they can only do this for so long. In the meantime, the inflation will continue to rise, making prices for everything higher. Eventually, the system will blow up into the hyperinflation.
What is the hyperinflation?
The hyperinflation is when people try to spend their cash into the economy before it becomes worthless. When the inflation rate is over 50% for longer than 1 month, that is the hyperinflation.
Is this some kind of nightmare? Has the hyperinflation ever ended well for anyone?
No, never. All occurrences of the hyperinflation throughout history have all ended in the complete destruction of the underlying economy.
What happens when you hyperinflate the currency?
You effectively plunge the economy into a state of poverty. It causes hardship for everyone and destroys the middle class for an extended period.
What can I do to protect myself from the Fed and the hyperinflation?
The best thing you can do is buy physical precious metals like gold or silver, and keep them outside of the banking system. The Fed cannot print more metal.
I have heard that cryptocurrencies also protect against inflation and are outside of the banking system.
Cryptocurrencies can be used as a store of value and can be kept outside of the banking system, but some people believe they are Ponzi schemes, rely on the greater fool in order to retain their value. Gold and silver have always been money and have never failed. They are the safest option to protect your money.
But gold is expensive. I cannot afford to buy gold.
That is why we buy the silver. The silver is undervalued compared to all other assets right now because the bullion banking cartel are suppressing the price. But that is the subject of a whole other video.
Where can I find out more about the silver?
There is a subreddit group called Wall Street Silver. You can join that group and they will take care of you.
Thank you. I will.
No problem. Goodbye.